I want you to join me on a challenging thought experiment. One that, depending who you are, might instill strong feelings, outrage, disgust, or not. We're going to look at where the science of genetics is going, how it's highly likely, bit by bit, that it's going to change how people see the world and the possibilities around them as human beings, until they end up at a point where a lot of people of today, if they could see it, would think that it was highly shocking, outrageous, a terrible outcome, in the same way that these good gentlefolk of yesteryear would have responded to the idea that in a few decades people would be dressed like this in public. Over time, attitudes change. It's always happened in the past. We shouldn't expect that's not going to be the way of the future. Back in 1978, we saw Louise, who was the first, inaccurately described, test tube baby. In vitro fertilization, in other words. Catholic theologians were against it. The American Medical Association was completely opposed to it. Nova magazine called it the biggest threat since the atom bomb. Now it's normal and uncontroversial, and increasingly, as we'll see, the way of the future. In 1996, we had Dolly the sheep, the first example of an animal being cloned. There was a huge debate about it.
Are we acting more like the creator than creatures? Are we trying to play the role of God and all this?
And they worried that inevitably it would be used to create human clones next. So yes, many people said that this was against the natural order of things. But now it's widely accepted and lightly used technology for cloning animals. It can help in animal research, for developing important medical treatments, even preserving endangered species. Over time, society just became more and more used to the idea and just accepted it. What about when it comes to human beings? I mean, that will never be acceptable, right? Right? Well, in this video, I'll show you not only that it could happen, but it almost certainly will happen. This video is about why the young people of tomorrow will have GMO babies.
Genetics. What can it mean? The ability to perfect the physical and mental characteristics of every unborn child.
Of genetic engineering to choose the genes.
There are 5 stages to this journey. Here's a heads up. The first stage is a stage that we're already on. Imagine you've been trying to have a baby for the last few years, and it's not been happening. So you've turned to IVF, in vitro fertilization. Couples undergoing IVF today can get their embryos screened before they're implanted in the woman's womb. What are they screening for? Genetic diseases. Probably they've had several eggs fertilized at once, and they can select the embryo that doesn't have problems if there's a difference between them. One of these procedures is called PGT-M, which stands for Pre-Implantation Genetic Testing for Monogenic Disorders. PGT-M can test for over 600 rare genetic conditions, including cystic fibrosis, early onset Alzheimer's. No parent wants such a condition to affect their child, of course, so if you're offered such screening, any parent is likely to take it. It gives you the opportunity to select one of your natural embryos to ensure that your child has the best chance of a healthy future. So you do the screening and you get an embryo report card with the genetic status of each of the embryos. Now, this might already make some people queasy. What you're effectively doing is you are judging between your embryos which one gets to turn into a human being. If you were being trivial about it, you could think of it like a genetic Tinder. You get to swipe left or swipe right depending on the genetic fit. Too much too early? Well, we can dignify it by putting it onto a sober report card. It's effectively the process that we're doing, based purely on avoiding terrible diseases for sure, and remember, nobody thinks that's a bad thing. That brings us to stage 2. Let's say the IVF worked and you now have kids, and they grow up mercifully free of genetic diseases, good job there, and they're now looking to have babies of their own. Now it's becoming normal to have IVF. Wait, what? Normal? Yes, indeed, because we can do something really rather amazing by this point. We can take any cells, say skin cells or cells from a sample of blood, and we can then convert those cells to stem cells. Stem cells are like how your cells were before they decided what they wanted to be when they grew up. They have the potential to become any type of cell, whatever's needed. And the point is, having reverted those cells back to that stage, they could then go on to become, say, an egg or sperm cells, and therefore able to be fertilized via IVF and implanted in the womb. So let's just say that again. His skin cell could be turned into sperm. Her skin cell could be turned into an egg, which could then fertilize and create a human being. I suppose if you really wanted to, you could do it the other way round, just for laughs. Why would you want to do it at all? Well, if you think about it, it's great for women, because harvesting eggs for IVF is kinda onerous. It's not a trivial process, and maybe IVF becomes more popular just because getting embryos now is not such an invasive, huge deal. But the real revolution comes in quantity. Whereas you had a handful of embryos at most to choose from, suddenly you might have 50 or even more to choose from. And there's no reason with this process not to create a lot more. Now, on the one hand, that gives you a lot more choice, so you should definitely be able to find one that is free of genetic diseases. Yeah, but is it going to stop there? Really? The technological difference between this stage and the next one is really quite a small one, but the attitude shift is significant. Imagine how the world changes once that technology becomes available. You might start to see places like this. A video was done as a mock advertisement for a baby factory of the future, Ectolife.
Ectolife allows infertile couple to conceive a baby and become the true biological parents of their own offspring.
People asked if it was real because they correctly realized that it might be. It could be. Not quite yet, but nearly. Responding to the video, Professor Joyce Harper, author of the book Your Fertile Years, said this about Ectolife. I have no doubt that at some point, most people will be produced by IVF, and this would be a possibility. In science, I think you should never say never. But why should it become the case that most children will be produced by IVF? Well, think about it. You've now got a process that can easily and reliably produce your genetic offspring in ways that don't have inheritable genetic disorders. How does that start to play out for natural couples who did not choose to use IVF, whose babies then go on to have genetic disorders? Do we think that there might start to be some judgment that flies around, human race being what it is? You know, if only they had used this entirely safe technique, that baby would be healthy. Honestly, do we think no one's going to say that? Not only that, of course, you also suddenly open up a potential for instance, same-sex couples to have children that combine their genes. A woman can have some of her skin cells made into sperm to fertilize the eggs made from her wife's skin cells. I'm thinking that's going to be pretty popular. You open up a few problems as well, because once again, those pesky humans will always find a way. So an obvious one would be non-consensual parenthood. Celebrities might suddenly find that some of their more devoted, shall we say, fanatical fans will be trying to get hold of a lock of hair or something they've touched, and suddenly they're going to find that they have offspring in the world that they never knew about. Or maybe even having samples of their cells on sale on the dark web. You could work through so many variations of that, I leave it to your imagination. But you just know that's going to happen. Now, is any of it remotely feasible? Oh yes. Research is well advanced on all of this. Considerable success with model animals has been achieved. There are still some obstacles to overcome, but progress is being made rapidly. And then that takes us to stage 3. Stage 3 is the natural consequence of having 50 to 100 embryos to choose from, because now you have a lot of embryos that pass the basic health screening. So how do you choose between all the potential healthy embryos? Toss a coin, pick a card. Sooner or later, probably sooner, people will want to be able to choose from genetic markers that they know signify things like high intelligence, athletic ability, all of the positive attributes that we know come from our DNA. Right now, this is definitely a step too far. This crosses a line. Even selecting a baby's sex in IVF is outlawed in many countries, except in very rare cases where there might be a genetic disorder that is expressed in one gender and not the other. The European Society of Human Reproduction. Sex selection should not be used for non-medical reasons. The Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority in the UK. Sex selection is forbidden. American Society for Reproductive Medicine does not actively encourage sex selection for non-medical reasons. A softer push against in that case. And that's the point. Not all countries are going to think the same about this, and unless somehow we create global rules that affect everybody, then effectively you're going to get permissive outliers, and that's going to create a global marketplace. Once you have that, you will have a bunch of parents who will find an excuse to travel to whichever country can help them. And the fact that some people are already starting to have it done will challenge those restrictive countries and start to change attitudes. And eventually some of them will start to make it possible in their own country. Just like the debate around assisted dying. People who want to end their lives because of living with unbearable medical conditions have been able to travel to places like Switzerland. Gradually, slowly but surely, other countries have started to consider whether a process for assisted suicide might not be so far beyond the pale for them to consider. Now that is one of the biggest taboos. So there's no reason to think that it wouldn't happen at least as quickly as that. The thing is, once you cross that line, you definitely create a two-tier system. People going the IVF route suddenly are able to have beautiful or smart or athletic or beautiful, smart and athletic babies. So the whole process of selecting for positive characteristics becomes normalized, and that leads naturally to stage 4, genetically modified babies. Now maybe you're having a baby the natural way, but there's a problem. Or you have an aggressive genetic defect that you can't get out of your embryos via IVF. In the former case, doctors decide that gene therapy is the way to go. We've already seen a study in the current day showing how surgically injecting DNA-stuffed viruses into mice can treat genetic diseases in the womb. The researchers used a genome editing technique called CRISPR to alter the DNA of lab mice in the womb in order to eliminate a serious liver disease before they'd even been born. That's CRISPR, which stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Palindromic Repeats. But you knew that. How does CRISPR work? It's based on the amazing way that bacteria defend themselves against viruses. So when a bacterium notices that a virus has invaded it, it notes a part of the virus's DNA and releases a copy of it called the guide RNA, or you could call it the target. This is attached to an enzyme called Cas9. The guide RNA leads the Cas9 to locate the matching segment of DNA on the virus, and when it finds it, the enzyme goes into scissor mode, snipping that bit out of the virus DNA and kind of ruining its whole day. Well, that's a very interesting process. So scientists reasoned, what if we could inject a segment of DNA at a specific place with this process, giving the Cas9 our own guide RNA, so it will enable us to insert changes at a precise location. This is an amazing gene editing technique already now being used in all sorts of scenarios, gene-edited plants, for instance. But it's still a work in progress, not reliable enough or precise enough to risk using on human embryos yet. So on the timescale we're talking about, you would definitely expect this sort of thing to be available. And we know this is likely to happen because it already happened. That's right. One doctor couldn't contain himself and he brought stage 4 right into the heart of a stage 1 society. This was Hu Zhongquai, scientist of the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen. He used CRISPR to disable a gene called CCR5 in human embryos that was subsequently brought to term and are alive now as children. Before we discuss the ethics of what he did, why would you even make that particular change? CCR5 is involved in the immune system, and the HIV virus uses it to infect human cells. The theory was that if you disabled it, you would make the babies resistant to HIV. And note, these embryos had no genetic abnormalities. They weren't being protected against some disease they already had. They were being made better, in this case to protect themselves from the disease that they might catch in the future. Scientists were pretty much agreed up till this point that if CRISPR was ever going to be used on a human embryo, it would be to fix a genetic defect for which there was no other cure. This guy blew straight past that. As you can expect, this was a huge scandal. Hu Zhangquai was sentenced to 3 years in jail. He's since served his time and been released. Scientists worldwide were clear this was a very, very bad thing to do. So far, changes from conventional gene therapy don't touch what's called the germ line, which means that the changes that are made don't get inherited by the next generation from those individuals. At the time of shooting this video, the children concerned are healthy, but the mutations in their CCR5 genes are slightly different to the naturally occurring ones that the scientist was trying to mimic. Since he came out of jail, he has said that he feels very guilty and fearful for the children involved. Well, that's nice, but not a lot of use to the children at this stage. But it was interesting in what one scientist said in relation to this case that is very relevant to what we're discussing here. With CRISPR, such an amazing tool, the last thing we want to do is to sour the whole world on its use because of some mistakes made early in the process. That's a very telling comment. Because yes, what I'm describing here, from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4, that could be slowed or maybe even averted for a number of decades if people try to jump ahead too quickly. So stage 4, you get used to the idea that genetic manipulation is being used with human embryos, but for the unarguable case of avoiding terrible diseases. Once you've got used to that, that enables human society at that point, and not before, to move to stage 5, where you can choose highly athletically gifted characteristics, plus Hollywood good looks, plus superior intelligence, and push them all into the same embryo. They will at that point ask themselves, why not? I mean, right now, we admire people who are gifted. We admire people who have genetic advantages in sports. But those genetic advantages came about by sheer fluke and accident. They weren't won by them by merit. They just happened. Of course, they put the work in after that to make the most of them, but those genetic advantages are just accident. Why should that be better than choosing to have them? But wait, on behalf of the current age, let's push back against this just a bit. What about all those concerns about eugenics? Did we just forget about all of those over this course of developmental history? Did we forget some really rather important lessons that we learned the hard way? Well, maybe, but then society might answer eugenics was about a government seeking to create a master race for its own ideological purposes. This, however, is different. It's about bottom-up parental choice, driven by their wish for the most successful children. It's easy not to see it as eugenics if it's not part of a government plan for its population. Okay, but I don't believe that states won't get involved at all. The earliest excuse that's already considered feasible and excusable is if you would have to genetically edit human genes to enable us to travel to other planets, to do things like maintain bone density after a long time in zero gravity, to be more resistant to damage from cosmic radiation, that kind of thing. But if there are some countries, like Russia, who instigated a covert doping regime in the past on behalf of their national athletes, it shouldn't be a surprise if some in the future do exactly the same thing, turning up genetically gifted athletes to compete for their nation. You can just about prove that someone's doping. How exactly do you prove that they're selecting genetically gifted embryos? And then you have a choice. Join them or get beaten by them. So look, I haven't mapped any of this out because I'm either in favour of it or that I'm specifically campaigning against it. This is not a campaigning channel. I just try to understand where I think we're going and what are the implications. But each step of the way that I've mapped out here makes logical sense. They get justified by wanting to do the right thing, and they will be controversial at first, but then people get used to the idea, as we have seen with previous steps. We may look ahead to that world and think that it's pretty dystopian. And maybe it is. Maybe what we have today would be considered to be a dystopia by those people from 150, 200 years ago, whose values and judgments we just trampled all over. And maybe they were right. But the point is, you kind of get used to your day-to-day living reality. I don't necessarily think we're talking about a long journey here, hundreds of years. I mentioned Professor Joyce Harper, who was asked to comment on the Ectolife video. She said she once took part in an Oxford Union debate on genome editing and whether it would undermine the nature of humanity. And she reported this. And I spoke for the motion because I think it will, but I can tell you I lost spectacularly. Young people don't have those hesitations that we have. And that, more than anything, makes me think that the changes that I've outlined here, enhanced by whatever new things we invent between now and then, will be a part of the future of the human race. Whether you think that should be the way of the future, or whether you think that's against the natural order of things, that speaks to your mindset a lot more than it speaks to the probabilities, I suspect. If you reached this far, presumably you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for notifications when new videos are released.